Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and I've got a stack of Atari 2600 cartridges here on the desk because I just got in the Atari 2600 Plus. Now this is not going to be for everyone, but I think if you have a friend or a family member who has a box of Atari stuff in their closet, this might be a fun gift to give them because it allows you to play all of those old games on a modern television, and you can even use the original controllers with it, and it feels quite convincing insofar as its replication hardware-wise to the original. And we're going to take a closer look at this in just a second, but I do want to let you know in the interest of full disclosure that I paid for this with my own funds. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. No one is paying for this review, nor has anyone reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what this Atari 2600 Plus is all about. Now the price point on this comes in at $129. It is pricey, but I think the cost is getting you a very convincing replica of the original. Atari says this is about 80% of the size of the original console. I just so happen to have an original console right here, so you can see the difference here. So it is a bit smaller, but it feels just almost identical to it in almost every way. So you've got the fake wood paneling on it. The plastic feels very similar. It's like the same grade of plastic. The switches here feel very deliberate and very hard to move, which is how the original felt. You even have a lot of friction on these controls here. It really mimics everything, I think, quite well. On the back, you've got your HDMI output, which of course replaces the RF output that the original had. You can plug your Atari controllers into the back here. They do give you one controller in the box, and they have additional controllers available for purchase. However, you can use the originals with this, and that includes the paddle controllers that work with a number of Atari games as well. So you do have some control options, and you very likely have one of these controllers kicking around. So I would look for these before you buy another one. And I did plug in an original controller, and it did work on here successfully. One thing that did not work, however, and this is important, are Sega controllers, because those do have the same pinouts as the Atari controllers, and my Sega Genesis and Master System controllers work fine on my original Atari. However, they don't work on this one, so you do need a real Atari controller or one of these new replicas. The controller actually feels quite close to the original. Not quite perfect, but certainly very close to it. It's got the stiffness that the original stick had. The button here feels a little bit different, but of course my controller is 40 years old at this point, so maybe this is what they felt like when it was new. But all in, they did a great job here replicating how the hardware feels. And these new controllers will work on the original console as well. Also on the back here, you have your difficulty switches, and you have an option for switching between the 16:9 widescreen and 4:3, which is a more square size image. That, of course, is what the original looked like, and I'll show you that in operation when we get everything booted up. It is powered by a USB cable. It has a USB-C port here in the back. Presumably, this is also how you might update the firmware on this. Yes, it has firmware, but at the time I'm shooting this video, there were no updates available. They do not, though, give you a power adapter, so you do need a phone or a tablet charger to plug into in order to power this. But beyond that, it feels like the real deal here. I'm really impressed by how close to the original this little mini console feels. Now they also give you a cartridge in the box because this requires cartridges to work. So there's no way to load an SD card game on it yet. You can't load any games in through the USB, although I'm sure somebody will jailbreak it at some point. So what you get here is this 10 games in one, and they give you Adventure, Combat, Dodge 'em, Haunted House, Maze Craze, Missile Command, Real Sports Volleyball, Surround, Video Pinball, and Yar's Revenge. And there's no menu on the cartridge. It's super old school, so you have to go in here and flick the dip switches in the order in which they are here on the label in order to get the game to work. And a little bit earlier, I did plug this cartridge into my original console, and it worked. So this is like super old school and how you would do a multi-game cart back in the day. Pretty cool stuff. Now, in addition to playing Atari 2600 games, this can also play Atari 7800 games, and they have a compatibility list up on their website here. I don't own a 7800 nor any cartridges, so I can't test those games out, but you can take a look here at the bottom of the list and get an idea of whether or not the games you want to play are compatible. This is an emulation console, unfortunately. although it's got two good emulators running things. So for the Atari 2600, it uses Stella, which is an open source emulator, and for the 7800, they use Pro System, also a open source emulator. However, the controller compatibility is seamless. You don't have to map any buttons. There are no menus to navigate. It really operates like the original console does without having to configure anything. And without further ado, why don't we plug it in and see how it works. All right, I've got my original copy here of Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. This I had as a kid way back in 1983 or 82 when it came out. And we're just going to pop it into the console here and flick the switch like we would on any other Atari console. And it does take a second or two for it to boot up. And of course, you do get a splash screen here. But what it does is it actually dumps the ROM into memory, and then it plays the game from the emulator. But as you can see here, everything just comes up and gets working. I will activate the sound here also to give you an idea as to how things sound here. So we'll turn this up, and if I go to hit game reset here, that should get us going. So I found the sound to be pretty good. I found the emulation to be decent. Stella's always been a good emulator, so it doesn't feel all that laggy to me, although it is not going to be as responsive as a real Atari would be on a CRT television. But as far as the experience of playing Atari games on a modern television, this is certainly going to, I think, do it for you, especially if you haven't touched an Atari in 35 years or so. And if you've got a lot of these old games kicking around, I think you'll have some fun booting them up again and having them work nicely here on your modern television. The system outputs at 720p only, but your TV will upconvert it to whatever resolution that it typically runs at. Now you have a black and white switch here, so you can turn the game into black and white mode like you could on the original. This is done through software, of course, but it does work as advertised. And then we've got that 16:9 to widescreen switch here, so I'll give you the full screen view. And as you can see, it stretches it out. This is not the natural resolution or aspect ratio for the game, so you definitely want to leave it in this mode, I think. But you can also see just how good the game looks on a modern TV. You really can't get an Atari game from an original console to look this good on an HD television. So cool stuff. It plays great. There's not a lot of friction to getting the games working, which I think is kind of a real plus of this console. And although it's expensive, it is, I think, a really nice way to replicate the feeling of having an Atari console plugged into your television. You will notice, of course, there are a lot of wires coming out of it. Just like the original, you have to contend with that. You might find yourself having to get a longer HDMI cable depending on how your room is structured. But if you're visiting your childhood home for the holidays and you know you got a big box of these cartridges in there, it's going to be a lot of fun to pull them out of the closet and boot them up on this modern console without a lot of complexity to get things going. One thing, though, you should prepare yourself for is cleaning the cartridges. This is one of my old cartridges that delivered this imagery when I first tried to get things going. So a little isopropyl alcohol on a Q-tip is usually good enough to get going. There's also some great products out there like the 1-Up card that make the cleaning process a little bit easier. But either way, expect to have some difficulties with your cartridges because they've likely been collecting dust for 30 years and are probably quite dirty. Now, as you saw earlier, there are 2 controller ports on the back, and you also have 2 switches for difficulty for each player, just like the original. I've got my original Space Invaders cartridge inserted right now as well. And as I flick that switch back and forth, you can see the second player getting fatter and thinner based on the difficulty setting that I have enabled with that switch. Additionally, I've got my original Atari 2600 controller that's usually behind me on the shelf there. And if we plug this in, we should be able to get it to work, again, with no configuration necessary. So I could play a 2-player Space Invaders game. So let's hit the reset switch here and have at it. And as you can see, both controllers are working, even though it's hard to play as 2 players with just one person here. But if I had more friends, I could have a lot of fun here playing Space Invaders just like I would do with my friends when I was a kid. And again, this is an original Atari 2600 controller that's probably 40 years old, and this one is brand new that came with our 2600 Plus. Now, unfortunately, flash cartridges like this Harmony cart do not work on the 2600 Plus. So if you want to play a game on here, you're likely going to need the original cartridge to get things working. That said, if you're somebody who's been very dissatisfied with the quality of clone consoles over the years, you're going to be very satisfied with the quality of this one. It feels almost identical to the real deal. And I've got one right next to me, and I was able to compare them side by side. It really feels good. The way the cartridge clicks in, the way the switches click, everything just feels right on this. Even the controller, which, although not perfect, is really close to how the original felt. So they put in a lot of effort to get the feel of this right. And if you are an Atari fan, I think you're going to really enjoy this from that standpoint, even if you could play the Stella emulator on a dozen other different platforms, if not more, and get similar visual results on a modern TV. I think from a gift-giving perspective, if you have a family member who you know has these cartridges sitting away in a closet somewhere, they're going to love this. And I don't think there's any better gift you could give on Christmas morning to somebody like that than this thing, because you can take this thing out of the box, clean your cartridges up. You probably have an extra controller in that closet too. You can plug this into your television and play a whole bunch of two-player games like Combat here and replicate probably a moment from your childhood when that Atari first came in the house. And that alone, I think, is worth the cost of entry here. But if you don't have a lot of Atari games around, this is probably not the best way to play them. There are certainly better ways to get a whole bunch of Atari games onto your modern television. There are some great compilations like the recent Atari 50th collection that I reviewed recently that's on all of the major platforms. But there's something special about this one because of its feel. And I was not expecting to have this reaction to this thing, but I think the reason that I am so positive about it is just the fact that they got the hardware design right. And for that reason, I think it might be a very good gift idea for someone who has some fondness for the old Atari. That's going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Brian Parker, Budley, Hot Sauce and Video Games, Steve Green, and Amda Brown. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.